Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. My name is Heather Heiman. I'm here with Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service. Thank you so much for joining us today for another of our quarterly webinars hosted by the Human Trafficking Prevention Project, which is a partnership between Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service and the University of Baltimore School of Law. We are very excited to be looking today at human trafficking and LGBTQIA populations, looking at cultural readiness, risk factors, and talking about a plan for action. I am very excited to have our guest presenters with us today. As many of you have heard from before, we have Jessica Emerson, who is the director of the Human Trafficking Prevention Project, and of course my partner with the HTPP. And then we are also extremely excited to have our guest presenter today. CP Hoffman is a staff attorney and the pro bono coordinator at FreeState Justice, where they advocate on behalf of Maryland's LGBTQIA plus community in court, at the state legislature, and with administrative agencies and local governments. A little bit more about CP. After graduating from the University of Illinois College of Law, they worked with New York City law firms for 5 years before pursuing graduate studies at the McGill University Institute of Comparative Law in Montreal. CP has also published broadly on the law and social justice, gender, and popular culture, as well as the intersections of all of these three areas. So thank you so much to both of you.
Thanks for having me.
We are very excited.
Welcome.
And you can see some pictures, even though we do not have live video today.
Just pretend I look that fabulous.
And just pretend you would teach me to take a selfie like that.
So a quick overview of our presentation goals today. We'll be first looking at an introduction to the LGBTQIA plus community and its terminology, looking at human trafficking risk factors, looking at the intersection of these communities in human trafficking, and in focus, looking at trans people in human trafficking, and then talking a bit about best workplace practices and allyship. And with that, I'm going to turn over the presentation.
Hey everyone. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the LGBTQIA community. And here we have a nice photo from Baltimore Pride, I believe it is, from this past year. And if we go to the next slide, I will tell you what LGBTQIA means, because you're probably familiar with some of these letters, but there's a whole lot of them here. So this is sort of the expanded acronym. You often hear LGBT or sometimes LGBTQ. This is the longer one. There's also a fun variation on it where the letters are moved around and it becomes quilt bag.
I have a dirty joke to tell about that. Just maybe, out of nowhere.
Maybe after the webinar. Sorry,
email me if you want that.
So this includes just going through the letters, lesbians and gay men, who, you know, I'm assuming most of you are familiar with those terms. Bisexuals and pansexuals, these are people who, bisexuals are people who are attracted to two or more genders. Pansexuals are people who are attracted to sort of all genders, or people of all genders. Transgender folk who are people who were assigned one gender at birth and then transition into another gender. Queer people, queer is sort of a catch-all term that a lot of, especially younger folk, find more welcoming than some of the very clearly defined older terms.
So just to interrupt you there is that, you know, something that I've heard, which I understand, is that there's a reticence to use the term queer because it was used, you know, in my parents' day as an insult. And so how would you advise folks doing this work around that term?
Well, so the big thing I would say is ask people how they want to be referred to themselves.
Yep.
But if you get into the history of the term queer, it was first used by people within the community in the early 20th century to define themselves. And then it was sort of borrowed by the broader culture.
As an insult.
Yeah, as an insult.
As an insult.
You know, and so there's it's a community term that was then used outside of the community, but then there's been a lot of reclaiming it, especially since the 1990s. If you look at academic programs and, publications and stuff, there's a lot of things in queer studies. It's sort of the shorthand term a lot of people, organizations, et cetera, use when they don't want to just use an acronym.
And we'll be sending out a tip sheet with a list of these terms and definitions after the webinar. And just one quick side note, if you'd like to ask questions during the webinar, please feel free to type in on this, and we will be keeping an eye on those and pausing during the webinar to answer any questions. The slides are also available for download.
And then the last two letters here, we have intersex people. Not all intersex people like to be included in the broader queer community, but intersex basically are people who it's an umbrella term that includes anyone who is sort of something other than wholly male or female at birth biologically. I'm not describing this well, but hopefully you understand. I have a really nice definition written down at my office. And then asexual and aromantic folks are people who don't feel sexual attraction or romantic attraction to other people. And they're part of the broader community. And there's often a lot of interlap between these things. So there's a lot of transgender lesbians or intersex intersex people who are everything, or asexual people of whatever group. There's just so much overlap, and that's really why a lot of people are shifting towards inclusive terms like queer as sort of I don't want to have to define every aspect of myself. It's just a shorthand, it's easy.
But for a lot of folks, being queer in whatever capacity is not the only discrimination they face, is not the only abuse they face. So I think, that last point, that different groups within this community face discrimination in different ways. Discrimination is also compounded by other identities and social factors. And anyone who knows me, who's on this webinar, knows that this is my jam. Intersectionality is my jam. And it simply is an explanation around the fact that we all exist at different intersections of oppression. And so like someone like myself, who is a white, straight, cisgender female, I do exist at the intersection of, misogyny, things like that, but I don't exist at the intersection of race, of disability, of being queer, and all of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as you add more and more things to people, it's discrimination can become quite severe. So, when you're talking about like Black trans women, it can be extremely severe.
Yeah. All right, let's get to some terminology.
So one of the things that's really important to understand the difference between is sexual orientation and gender identity. A lot of the sort of older understanding of like gay issues sort of conflated these. But basically sexual orientation is who you're attracted to. So, if you're a man attracted to a man, or a woman attracted to a woman, or a man attracted to a woman, or, whatever, it sort of encompasses your like physical or emotional attraction to the same or other genders. But this is different from your feeling of your gender and your gender identities.
And I like that, we have physical and or emotional attraction, because as you previewed previously, it doesn't always have to be a physical attraction to someone. It can just be an emotional. Like I might be emotionally attracted to you, but I may not have any physical desire to be with you. And so that's really important.
Yeah, and you definitely see people who, they're like attracted to people of all genders, but when it comes time to like form a long-term relationship, they tend to have one gender that they form that like emotional attraction to.
So you mentioned this is very different than gender identity.
Yeah, so this is the internal sense of like being male, female, or something else. It doesn't really have any connection to who your attracted to, who you want to, marry at the end of the day or whatever. It doesn't really have any connection to, I mean, there's correlation, but there's not a direct connection to what your external body is. It's just mostly like an internal sense of, this is what I am. I am a woman, I am a man, I am a something else. I am a non-binary person. I am, in fact.
Right. I think that's really crucial, because I think a lot of folks that do this work kind of look for these external cues on what does this mean, and gender identity, it doesn't have anything to do with that. I could present as the most feminine person in the world and that not be my gender identity. And so it's really important not to make those assumptions.
And then sort of the third thing that sort of falls under here is gender expression, which is the way that you express that internal gender externally. So this is the clothes you wear, sort of your demeanor in the world, how you talk, all of these things that are read by society as masculine or feminine or something else.
Right. So this is the outward piece. All right. So we talked about sexual orientation versus gender identity. Let's drill down a little bit into gender identity.
So one of the things that you kind of have to start with when talking about gender identity is this idea of like your sex assigned at birth, which is usually based on like your physical anatomy in almost all cases. But the doctor in the hospital will look at you and your genitalia and say, oh, it's a boy, it's a girl. Every once in a while they'll be, oh, they look like they're intersex. And then there's this whole other debate that goes on, and I'm not going to get into it today because I go on forever. And then if your identity going forward conforms to the thing that the doctor said and wrote down on the piece of paper that they sent the state, then you're considered cisgender. Cis is just a Latin prefix that means the same or this side of. So it means that you identify with, your gender identity is congruent with the sex that was assigned to you at birth. Transgender people, on the other hand, are people whose gender identity is not aligned with the sex assigned at birth.
Right.
So, yeah.
So it's really important to remember that despite us talking about sex assigned at birth and male and female and identifying as such, that's not really the end of the game. It's not just a binary world, right?
It's not, as I am happy to tell people.
Yay.
At great length. So in addition to sort of the standard ideas of, man, woman, boy, girl, there's a lot of people who don't fit into that. So first off, we have people who are gender nonconforming or gender variant. And these are people who generally, they generally connect to that gender assigned at birth, but there's some elements of their behavior or their dress or something that is read by society as being associated with another gender.
So that gender expression piece that we talked about.
Yeah. On the other hand, there's also this broader universe of non-binary people. Now, non-binary is an umbrella term for gender identities that fall outside of the easy male-female dichotomy. And so we're sort of everything else. And there's a lot of other terms that people use to describe their identity. You'll sometimes hear genderqueer, and then there's some specific terminology within the umbrella, like agender or bigender, that means specific things. Agender is like you have no gender, it's just you don't experience gender. Bigender is like you have two genders. You'll also see gender fluid, where like your gender shifts over time. Everyone sort of uses their own terms and prefers different language. One of the fun things about non-binary folk is that since we're by and large people who have said, no, these two boxes you have we don't fit into these, there's a lot of disagreement as to what exactly we do fit into. So we all have strong opinions.
But we are going to get back to those boxes in a couple of slides, which is really, really crucial.
And then I and many non-binary people use they, them pronouns when referring to themselves, but not everyone does. Everyone has their own preferences. There's some people who use, they all have multiple sets of pronouns. So I have a good friend who uses both they, them, and he, him pronouns. And I will switch off how I'm referring to them in the middle of a sentence, and he really loves that.
I have a friend who is perfectly comfortable with she, he, they, them. All the things work.
There's also some what are called neo-pronouns, which are, things introduced into the language and to replace like he, him, she, her, etc. Z, her is sort of the most common that I see.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about transition. A lot of folks who are new to this world wonder what transition means, what it looks like, and our point is that there is no such thing as just one transition. There are multiple types of transition. So can you start there?
Yeah, so there's lots of different ways that someone may or may not transition if they're transgender.
Or may not is crucial.
Yeah. And also, when we're talking about non-binary people, in general, non-binary is lumped under the trans umbrella, but there's some people who feel that they are more or less included in that. So, there's going to be, certainly the non-binary people who are less comfortable with the transgender label are going to be doing fewer of these things. So the first thing that a lot of people do is they'll socially transition. They'll adopt a name or pronoun that are consistent with their identity. So they'll tell their friends and family, hey, start using she, her pronouns with me. Or, I really think that I love the name Aiden or something like that.
Which is not the name that maybe I was brought up as. Okay.
Yeah. So they start to do things to transition socially, but without necessarily doing other stuff.
So it's more the outward presentation. Like, how do you refer to me? How do I present myself?
And how you present, like, people will sometimes start wearing different clothing or, various things.
Legal.
Closely related to that, there's legal transitions where, you might have started to use a name, but it's not the name on your ID. So you go to court and you get a name change and you get some paperwork filled out and such so that you can get your gender marker changed on identity documents. And depending on what state it is, it can be either extremely easy or fairly complicated. But here in Maryland, it is fortunately pretty straightforward.
And as of October of this year, October 1.
As of October 1st, you can now go to the Motor Vehicle Administration and change your gender on your license or state-issued ID without having to present any documentation at all. And the state has now started allowing you to select a third gender marker on your license, which is an X.
Yay, Maryland.
So on October 1st, I and a bunch of other folks showed up at the MVA and we all got our new X markers.
I'm really sorry you had to go to the MVA, generally speaking.
But it was fun though, because it was like, all the non-binary folk descended on
it's like a party
on like the Glen Burnie branch of the NDA because that's their main location. Okay. And it was like people you'd never met before. You just sort of caught their eye while waiting in line. Yeah. Like, hey, you're here with me, aren't you?
And there are no document requirements.
No.
There's no. I think is there the new license fee of $20?
Yeah, you have to pay a $20 fee to get a new license.
Okay.
And then the
a $20 fee generally.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
but there's
All
not any
right.
additional.
Right.
It's the same
It's
fee.
not just for somebody who wants to.
No, it's the same fee
Just
as
to be
if you had
aware.
lost your license.
Exactly. Right. Okay.
And there's basically just like there's a touch screen that they have up, and there's like a little button that you push that says, I want to select a different gender marker, and then you select the three.
Good job, Marilyn.
So
All right,
Yeah.
so we talked about social, we talked about legal. Let's talk about medical, which is usually the piece that
Yeah, so
makes people the most confused and or inappropriate.
yeah, so a lot of cis people have this old idea of gender transition is focused on like a
What's
medical
beneath the
procedure.
skirt.
Yeah, that you go in and you
Right.
get quote the surgery,
Right.
and then you're a woman or a man or whatever. But there's lots of different things that people do, and it's individualized to everyone. Everyone decides to do kind of their own thing, and by and large, you don't have to get surgeries to do anything else.
You
can.
You don't have to do anything else to declare the things that we've talked about,
Yeah.
your sexual orientation, your gender identity.
Yeah, if you wanted to update your birth certificate in Maryland, for instance, you would have to have a medical provider sign a form that says that you're receiving some sort of treatment for gender dysphoria.
Right.
It doesn't define what that treatment is, and the form can be signed by like I think by a licensed therapist, or at least like a psychiatrist or something,
Yep.
And so so the treatment could be like therapy rather than something else. But in a lot of cases, what the treatment is hormone replacement therapy, which basically for people assigned female at birth, it usually involves taking testosterone. Usually the testosterone just overpowers their natural production of estrogen, so they don't have to take an estrogen blocker.
Which has its it's fine.
For people assigned male at birth, there'll usually be a testosterone blocker, and then they'll take estrogen on top of that. Sometimes some people will also take progesterone, or some other things. There's various hormones people take, but those are sort of the two simplest things. A lot of people assigned male at birth will go through some level of hair removal to remove facial hair, especially there's some other sort of minor things that people do, and then people will sometimes get affirming surgical procedures. So a lot of trans masculine people, trans men, etc., will get what's referred to as top surgery, which is removing the breast tissues. There's various other things people do. That's one of the most common ones that you hear about is top surgery.
But you don't have to do any of those things.
You don't have to do any of them to be a legitimate trans person. And everyone sort of makes their own decision as to what's right for them.
Awesome.
And sometimes it's influenced by what their health insurance will pay for.
All right, so let's talk about some terminology and questions that folks have.
Yeah. So the big thing to remember when dealing with trans people is that trans people are people. We're human beings. We deserve human dignity. We deserve to be treated like you treat everyone else.
Yeah.
So remember that transgender is an adjective, not a noun. So don't refer to the transgenders or
transgendered.
Yeah, or transgendered.
Which I hear all the time.
You can say transgender people or people who are trans, or there was a trans woman that I worked with, or the trans community or whatever. It's an adjective. It isn't the essence of our being.
Right. Great.
But then also, just generally think before you speak. In the same way that, you don't necessarily need to say the black woman at the store. You don't have to say the black woman. You can say there was a woman at the store. You don't necessarily need to reference someone's transgender status unless it's actually important to what you're saying.
Right.
So I had a client.
Hint. It's probably not.
So you could say, I had a client, she had this thing that happened to her or something. You don't have to necessarily say, I had a trans client and this thing happened to her. And maybe it's important to the story, but it probably isn't.
Well, so one of the things that I always work on with my students is that you can ask anything you want as long as there is a legal reason for you to ask, right? So, for instance, with a trans client who is a trafficking survivor, them being trans is relevant because in a lot of cases, that's what made them vulnerable. They were, all these things that we're going to talk about. But whether or not they had the surgery is not relevant.
Yes.
Right?
That's not
so
going to be relevant.
It's about like thinking before you speak. Is the person's transgender status or their sexuality or their gender identity, are any of those things relevant? Sometimes they are. Mm-hmm. But then when you drill down, sometimes those things are not super relevant.
Yeah. And sometimes like talking about people in ways that focus on their transgender status or their sexual orientation or their race or whatever, it can be incredibly othering.
Yeah. And, I think one of the things that I've taught folks in my life is if you wouldn't ask me about what's going on between my legs, why would you think it's okay to ask someone else? So just thinking about that and making it a part of like your, no, that's awkward. Yeah. That's really important. All right, so we are going to transition from some of these definitions. Yes, we are, from these transitions to trafficking risks and factors, okay? So you see the terms hetero and cisnormativity. I'm going to explain those through my own lens. I am a cisgender female, straight cisgender female. I never had to come out to my parents as somebody who liked boys. I never had to sit my parents down and go, Mom and Dad, I don't know how you're going to take this, but I like guys. Never had to do that. I also never had to sit them down.
Shame.
So, yeah, I know. So when I popped out, you talked about assigned gender, sex assigned at birth. So when I popped out, they looked between my legs and they said, it's a girl. And I grew up feeling that term was perfectly appropriate for me. So I never had to sit my parents down and go, my sex assigned at birth was female, and I totally feel like a female.
You didn't have a gender reveal party that revealed
well, those
that you're...
things are stupid.
Yeah.
But anyways, so we have to, as advocates, understand that society assumes everyone, like someone of the opposite sex, everyone, their gender identity is the sex that they were assigned at birth. That is the way that we live our lives. But that is not true, right? So when trans folks, when the LGBTQIA community exists, they exist outside of this norm. And so it's really important to just simply acknowledge, if you are not a part of that community, that your life has been much more easy as a result of those things. So the population, LGBTQIA folks, are subject to strong negative stereotypes. Folks are not a real man, not a real woman. And you actually had a good
so I was saying that this isn't just like trans people. This is,
right.
Gay men. This is lesbians. They're told, oh, you're not a real man because you like other men. You're not a real woman because
you weren't assigned female at birth.
Or or you're not a real woman because you want to have sex with women. Like
right.
It's used to attack like everyone within the queer community.
Right.
It's also used to attack like straight cis people sometimes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of like gender non-conforming straight cis women who are getting a lot of crap in bathrooms in the UK right now because people are thinking that they're trans and that they shouldn't be there or something. It's really ridiculous, and it's just someone has short hair.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the other things that was always taught to me as I was unlearning some of the stereotypes is this issue around promiscuity and immorality, and saying that somebody who, you know, is gay was sexually abused, right? And as a result of that, they now like the opposite sex, and that's not true. People are mentally ill. People are more likely to get STDs. Actually, the data indicates the opposite.
And you know, on the promiscuous, immoral thing, it's also like, if you're going into things assuming that queer people are promiscuous, then you're going to be really biased when dealing with like queer prostitutes and people who are trafficked who are queer.
Sex workers.
Yeah, sorry. Queer, I'm sorry, you're right. Queer sex workers.
I don't love that term, sorry.
No, you're right.
Right. So
yeah.
You're going to be very biased kind of coming into things and into your beliefs about why somebody might be involved in sex work, and we're going to get to that. The other thing that was never told of me when I did not come out to my parents was that I was going through a phase as being attracted to boys. But that is a very significant experience that queer people have, which is they're going through a phase. They'll outgrow what's happened to them.
Oh, you're just a tomboy.
No. Oh, okay, we got it. Families may not be supportive. I'm kind of going to skip this because we're going to get into that. And limited role models. I will admit things have changed very recently. There are a ton more role models now, especially around trans identity, not so much around non-binary identity. But regardless, depending on where you live, very limited role models. So let's just talk about some of the risk factors around the LGBTQIA community as far as bullying, discrimination, and rejection. So we're just going to throw some really unfortunate and I don't even know, statistics at you, which is that LGBTQIA youth are more than twice as likely as their non-LGBTQIA peers to be harassed or assaulted at school. 4 in 10 LGBTQIA people say the community in which they live is not accepting of them or their community. More than 30% of LGBTQIA youth report experiencing physical violence within their family of origin that is directly related to them coming out in terms of their sexual orientation or their gender identity. And interrupt me whenever you want to. 26% of all LGBTQIA youth report having to leave their family of origin due to rejection of their gender identity and or their sexual orientation. LGBTQIA youth are 2 to 3 times more likely to attempt suicide than their non-LGBTQIA peers.
And you can see how all of these feed into each other. You know, if your community does not accept you, if your family does not accept you, if you have to find somewhere else to live, then you know, you're going to feel hopeless and like suicide is your only option in some instances. And you know, fighting back against this is just so important.
And I think it's also crucial in terms of the folks who are listening to this who are not a part of the community. This is where you play a role. This is where your experiences, your behavior, all of those things actually impact people, because this is not necessarily this population acting out against itself. This is this non-population acting against these individuals. And so as a non-member of the LGBTQIA community, I have to accept responsibility for the fact that people in my community are the people who are actually doing this to folks. And just to kind of drill down even between the LGBTQIA community is that 41% of transgender people, so we know that lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer questioning, intersex, or asexual, that is a monolith. And if you drill down, if you're talking about just the T, 41% of transgender people attempt suicide at some point in their lives, compared with 4.6% of the general public. So if we move on from bullying and discrimination and we move on to homelessness, 78% of LGBTQIA youth in foster care run away or are removed from their placements due to hostility towards their perceived sexuality and gender presentation. So what we have to actually think about is that this term, this actual quote, is about youth in foster care. So they're already experiencing so many different kinds of challenges, right? So this is not 78% of this population. This is 78% of youth in care who are removed from their homes for some particular reason, right? So this is an exceptionally high-risk population of youth, and then 78% of those youth run away or are removed from their place.
And they're placed with a home that's supposed to be more welcoming to them, or safe, and then they still
more safe.
Yeah,
not necessarily more welcoming.
Well, yeah.
More safe. But I think that what your comment highlights is that safety looks a lot of different ways. It's not just physical safety. 56% of LGBTQIA youth in care, again, spent time living on the streets. 58.7% of LGBTQIA homeless youth have experienced sexual violence, compared to 33.4% of heterosexual homeless youth. So again, this comparison about homeless youth or homeless teens generally, the impact of sexual violence is very different when you compare cisgender heterosexual youth compared to LGBTQIA youth.
And often people, like queer youth, will be targeted because they're perceived as promiscuous, or someone wants to like show that they're not gay or something, like with queer women or queer girls, like they'll be targeted, it's really unfortunate.
I know this is not the sunny part of our presentation. There was a survey of nearly 1,000 homeless youth in New York City. LGBTQIA youth were 7 times more likely than their heterosexual peers to have traded sex for a place to stay. Transgender youth were 8 times more likely than non-transgender youth to trade sex for a place to stay. And I think the thing that should shock your conscience more than anything is that the LGBTQIA community represents approximately 7 to 9% of the population, but of all homeless youth, 40 to 46% of that population identify as LGBTQIA. And again, speaking as somebody who is not a member of the population, if you can't acknowledge that we've failed these kids, then I don't really know what to tell you. Sorry. So we'll switch from homelessness to barriers to service. So a lot of LGBTQIA folks struggle with limited access to necessary services, right? So barriers to receiving basic or necessary services on the basis of their sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. And this may include, but is not limited to, access to shelter, counseling, and healthcare, including transition-related medical services. I remember, things have changed since the early aughts when I was rocking it back in New York City. I know that was so cheesy. But I remember for the first time taking a trans client to a very well-known service organization that was, pretty much the main place that we could get shelter for, these kids, young folks. And my client, when we got there, they were like, yeah, I'm not staying here because they won't respect my pronouns or my name or any of those things. And I also knew that right outside of those doors, there were 2 traffickers who were way waiting for, I mean, obviously I was there, so I was like, we're leaving and we're going somewhere else. But that was not the experience of the majority of those kids, because they go there, they don't feel safe, there are barriers to their access, and then there are traffickers sitting outside and waiting.
Quick pause for a question. One of our attendees was asking about the data regarding the youth that were in foster care, where the studies are from. Was that the Urban Institute?
No, it was, and I actually meant to update this, and I feel bad. I actually have this updated elsewhere. It was a study. Can I get back to them?
We'll follow up.
I have
an
it.
answer.
I didn't
maybe
do
some
it.
links to some
Yeah.
resources.
Absolutely. There was a national survey, and then Maryland was one of the sites. So I apologize. The other thing, like I talked about, is negative experiences, violence or discrimination at the hands of law enforcement, social service staff on the basis of folks' perceived sexual orientation and gender identity. And these experiences really make it less for this population to seek out the services they desperately need. And so, what I hear a lot in kind of the HT circle is, why don't folks, want to take advantage of what we have to offer? You need to think about how welcoming your services are to different populations, which we will get into. And the other thing is really honest lack of knowledge. It's common for providers to lack the knowledge or experience to confidently care for this particular population. My favorite part is criminalization. In 2015, the Urban Institute published the results of a 3-year study of 283 youth engaged in survival sex in New York City who identified as LGBTQIA, which means young men who have sex with men, or YWSW, which is young women who have sex with women. Just to kind of set the stage, there were high levels of social and familial discrimination and rejection, all the things that we've talked about. The common experiences of this particular group of youth were frequent arrests for quality of life and misdemeanor crimes, right? So these are things like trespassing. These are things like prostitution. These are things like dealing small amounts of drugs. And they're really about survival crimes. And once these individuals have this record and have arrests on their record for these particular crimes, this leads to continued involvement in the street economy because they can't get jobs, they can't get housing, all these things. And it's just an unfortunate vicious cycle. So how does all this connect to trafficking? This is pretty obvious. Histories of abuse and neglect are easily exploited by traffickers. Homelessness is incredibly common, which leads to engagement in the underground economy or survival sex. It's really important to point out that a lot of surveys have highlighted that most of this population report being introduced to the commercial sex trade by their peer networks, not by traffickers. And so, I know that there's a want within the anti-trafficking community to always say there's a trafficker looming in the distance. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that when you're on the street and you have no source of income and you have no source of support, guess what? You always have something to trade.
Yeah, and so much of that is tied into, if you go to the next point, queer youth, especially trans youth, can have so much difficulty getting consistent employment. Mm-hmm. If you're homeless and you're trans and, all of these things build on each other, and they can make it practically impossible to get consistent employment and consistent money to live on. Mm-hmm. And so, people turn to what they can.
I mean, when we talk about, collateral consequences, the first thing we cover is housing. Mm-hmm. Because homelessness is the linchpin, right? Because you can't have somebody mail you stuff that you need if you're homeless. You may not have somewhere for somebody to actually call you. You may struggle to get up and get to an appointment because you're homeless. And with regards to trans youth in particular, when you're dealing with an organization that has a very high level or a high bar to you know, getting hormones and things like that, you're setting folks up to fail. Yeah, we're gonna actually just go through this. You can take a look at this. 641 homeless youth in 10 cities were interviewed. There was a high level of trafficking, but when you talked about this particular youth population, it jumped from 14% to 24%.
And we can send out links to these too. I feel like these were two really important studies that were done by Covenant House and Urban Institute looking at these issues in more depth.
Do you want to talk a little bit about this topic and then we'll get into allyship?
Sure. So, yeah, we've already talked about how queer youth are disproportionately represented among homeless. And a lot of this we sort of hit on already.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about that fourth point.
Yeah. So this really goes back into that whole idea of assuming queer people are immoral. There's this default assumption a lot of people have that, you know, if you see a trans woman or trans girl out on the street, you know, just
particularly trans women, you're
just
right.
walking around, minding her own business, that she's a prostitute. Sorry, that she's a sex worker.
Thank you. Thank you.
I apologize. And so, you know, there's people who are literally just minding their own business who get, you know, bullshit citations from the police, and they get harassed by, you know, people walking down the street and all sorts of things, and they're just trying to exist in the world.
Right. So we talk about walking, you know, existing while Black is around criminality generally, but walking or existing while trans is very, very much connected to whether or not you are engaging in sex work. All right, so just a couple of statistics. 21% of all transgender women have been incarcerated at some point in their lives. And again, the intersectional piece is that 47% of Black trans women have been incarcerated. The bottom bullet point, 39.6% of transgender people involved in sex work who appeared in court reported biased treatment by judges or other court employees. So we're just trying to kind of highlight a segment of the LGBTQIA population that has it different, for lack of a better way to.
And that also leaves aside the bias by, well, it's sort of on the point above it, but the bias by law enforcement officers themselves.
And just the amazing amount of system failure across the board too. That's what all this is leading up to, and that's something we have to keep in mind as we're advocating.
And if anyone has not read the federal report on Baltimore City Police Department, you need to. There's a huge piece of the report that focuses specifically on street-involved women, but specifically on sex workers and trans folks, and talks about how the Baltimore Police Department does not do their job.
I am shocked to hear this.
I know you are, CP. All right, so let's talk about best practices in allyship.
So one of the really important things when dealing with clients or, you know, whatever you're calling people who come in to work with you, is don't necessarily make assumptions about their gender identity. You know, make sure that your intake forms ask people about their preferred pronouns, or sorry, their pronouns, not their preferred pronouns.
Just because you said that, a lot of my students say that, and I am always like, no. Why is preferred pronouns a problem?
So they, them aren't my preferred pronouns. They're just my pronouns. They're the pronouns I use. If you say preferred,
think you are, they are what you are.
Exactly. If you say preferred, then it sounds like, oh, you've made a choice to do this, and it's like, no, it's just a reflection of
I prefer to be skinny. It's not real. That's a different thing than who I am.
Yeah. We do frequently use the term preferred name, though, because it's important in a lot of contexts to, you know, if you're doing legal work on behalf of someone, you'll need to know their legal name so that you can file petitions under that name. But, you know, so you there kind of have to have a distinction of, well, the name that they go by, we sort of refer to as their preferred name. But make sure that you actually have a way for people to state this, like when you're doing intake or whatever. Having an option on your form is fabulous. I also noticed that there's a lot of like online forms, especially, that will have like a, select your title option, and it's like Mr., Ms., Mrs. Sometimes they'll be like 40 deep with like Admiral, like Professor, like
True.
all these things.
True.
And
I always just skip that because I'm like, I'm not any of those things.
every once in a while,
you have to fill it in.
every once in a while they're required. And so make sure that you have a gender neutral option like mix, MX on your forms. That then gives those of us who use them something to put in and not have to claim that we're like a rear admiral or whatever.
Which has a lot of dirty jokes attached to it.
Again, email Jess later.
Again,
for jokes.
email me for those. But the one thing that I think that I see, unfortunately, more than any is, the check boxes, female, male, or other.
Oh, or even worse, female, male, and transgender.
I feel like other's still worse than that.
Other,
Other's still, because you don't even have.
Well, so other allows the idea that there is something else outside of this. And in fact, like the MDA language, like when you choose something other than male or female, the third option is unspecified or other.
That's fair.
But when the third option is transgender, I'm making air quotes that you all can't see. It suggests that like that's our gender, not that we're a woman or a man or whatever. And it's, if you want to track transgender status, then
because
ask
being
us.
transgender does not eliminate male or female.
Exactly.
I love it.
If you want to track transgender status, ask a separate question that
That's
says,
fair.
do you consider yourself to be transgender?
So we have, do you include pronouns in your email signature? This is something that I do, that I know you do, that I know Heather does. And why is this important? So in my email signature, it's my name, it's my title, it's where you can reach me, and then there's my pronouns.
Yeah. And, this is one of those things that actually is very helpful to kind of everyone, because it signifies to other people how to refer to you in a way that's respectful. But there's a lot of people who have like ambiguous names that, they're frequently misgendered, even though they're cis. So I went to law school with a cis man whose name was Ashley. And every time someone called on him the first time in class, it was like, Ms. Burden, could you talk about this? And you'd be like,
I went to law school with a Spencer, and it was always Mr. Hall, and we were all like, no.
And so, allowing people to signify like in their email signature, because email is a means of communication where you don't see the person. Like you have nothing to go by other than just that name. Frequently.
Isn't it bigger than that? It kind of, so if I see that, then I know perhaps that I might be in an affirming space.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you like putting pronouns in your signature lines and other places, it signals that you kind of know what you're talking about and that you're vaguely welcoming. Now, it doesn't always work out in the same way that, someone wearing a, safety pin on their jacket, a couple of years ago, be like, we understand you mean well. But
we get it.
It's at least like, it's a sign that you kind of maybe understand.
You're in a better place.
Yeah.
All right. What about using gendered language when it's not necessary?
Yeah, so there's a lot of there's a lot of gendered language that's just wholly unnecessary. A lot of like, talking about generic third people as like he or she or whatever, and it's like, you can use they. Just use they. There's a lot of welcoming people with like, ladies and gentlemen, or greeting everyone as like ma'am or sir or whatever. I have the joke here, ma'am, this is a Wendy's.
This is a Wendy's.
Which any of you who are extremely online will appreciate as a meme joke.
All right, so let's get into in our last couple of minutes, just some best practices. Just kidding. Analyze, no, we're on a different slide. Analyze all workplace policies and procedures to make sure they foster a culture of inclusivity. And a couple of things to think about is, does your non-discrimination policy include gender identity and sexual orientation? Does your health insurance policy cover transition-related care? Do paperwork and record-keeping procedures respect individuals' gender identity and their chosen names? Are there gender-neutral options? We kind of went through the male, female, other / transgender. Are there gender-neutral facilities in your organization, like bathrooms? So those are really some very specific things around workplace policies and procedures that I would urge everyone listening to get involved in. And then just to kind of be a little bit broader, call out, call in those who discriminate against LGBTQIA people. Do you feel comfortable explaining call out versus call in?
Yeah, so call out is sort of like someone does something that's like, really horrific or whatever, and and you're like, and calling out is sort of like, hey, this person did this thing, we should not do that, and
or you should not.
Yeah, you should not do that, whatever. But it's often done in a way that's like kind of focusing on the bad that they did in a sort of shaming kind of way.
That's not always our relationships with folks.
Exactly.
I'm perfectly comfortable with calling certain people out. There's a lot of people in my life that I would like to help understand things a little bit different.
Yeah. Now, calling in, on the other hand, is more like, hey, I know that you're still working on this issue, but here's how we should refer to this person. Right. And going forward, let's respect their dignity. Right. It's more like trying to bring them into the conversation rather than, shame them for their bad behavior.
Which some people deserve.
Which, yeah, some people deserve.
Be open to other perspectives other than your own. That's pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah, and this next point, challenge your own assumptions about LGBTQIA people and identities, especially if you're queer. Like, there's a lot of queer folk who, a lot of cis queer folk who have preconceptions about trans people. And a lot of them are not remotely true. And, sort of question your own assumptions and be willing to deal with the person as a person.
Yeah. So be aware of the ways you may be perpetuating assumptions about hetero or cisnormativity. I use my mom as a great example of this. There was an experience that we had out on vacation somewhere, and the neighboring folks, they had who appeared to be a cisgender male. And this young person came to the house and was, whatever. And my mom said to them, wow, you must really be kind of, the ladies must love you, essentially. And the kid left, and I said to my mom, how do you know he is not gay? How do you know he is cis? How do you know? And she was like, oh my goodness.
Yeah. Or the thing that I find just like horrifying is the sheer amount of sexualizing in cis-normative ways kids. Like the assumption that, the cute little 3-year-old boy is a ladies' man, or that he and his like little girl friend are going to grow up and get married, but not he and his 3-year-old boyfriend from across the street. And it's like there's all these assumptions about like how
sexuality
and how like it's normal when it's heterosexual and
it's
cis.
Not.
But if you suggest, but maybe the 3-year-old girl will actually down the road marry her friend who's also a girl, or whatever. People are like, what? How could you raise that subject? That's sexualizing these kids. And it's like, but you just did it.
You just did it.
You literally just did it.
Well, I think it's very normalized in just small talk that happens all the time. And
I catch myself doing it all the time.
I do too, and I always try to fight against it, especially as a parent, and not, be making any kind of assumptions or putting labels on people when, that's just not the appropriate thing to do. But it's pervasive in trying to catch yourself.
And that kind of leads to the next piece, which is encourage your family and friends and yourself to re-examine your beliefs and your biases. And the most important piece is when it's personally uncomfortable to do so, either to challenge yourself or to challenge someone else. It is privilege to be able to sit back and say, I'm not going to say anything because this might make me uncomfortable in my relationship with this person. That is the key to undoing racism, misogyny, transphobia, homophobia, is get ready to have those uncomfortable conversations. It's really important. So as so many of us do, we screw up.
I screw up.
I screw up.
I have
All the
friends who
time.
I sometimes inadvertently misgender. And,
Yeah,
you know,
same.
what you do is you apologize and you move on and you make a point of doing better next time.
And you don't need to like make it the focus of your life.
You don't need to be like,
I don't need to like dedicate a scholarship to you because I misgendered you once.
I am so sorry. That must feel so invalid. No, just move on.
No. I'm sorry. I will do better next time. This is a huge piece for me.
Yeah.
Which is that remember that marriage equality is not the only or most important issue facing the community. The fight for queer rights is not over just because of Obergefell. It's very easy at this point to support marriage equality.
Yeah, and
move on.
You know, right now the Supreme Court is considering whether you can fire queer people, you know, whether they're gay or trans or whatever, you know, but whether they can be fired just because they're gay or trans or whatever. And we're not super optimistic about that case.
And I think it's just that this is not, it's not a one issue.
Yeah.
People experience things based on the intersections in their lives. And this kind of is a piece that's big to me, is that if you have it, like I do, use your privilege to help marginalized communities in any respect, in all spaces that you occupy. And that could be a whole nother webinar.
Yeah.
But we're gonna move on from there. These are a few resources for legal and medical stuff for the population that we've been talking about. There's also opportunities for additional learning that you can take a look at.
Here's our contact information again.
There it is.
So I just want to say a huge thank you. This was such an excellent presentation and I think an important discussion. And again, we will be circulating the slides from this webinar as well as some additional resources afterwards. We thank everyone for joining us. And please feel free to reach out to our presenters if you have any additional questions. Again, as this is part of the MVLS webinar series, you can follow us on social media to hear about upcoming events. And we do encourage you to volunteer with MVLS if you're an attorney out there and you'd like to take pro bono cases. We do a lot of work supporting the LGBTQIA community, including things like name and gender change, petitions, other legal services that can really be critical to those that need to get free legal help. So we hope you'll consider joining us as a volunteer.
You can also join FreeState's panel of pro bono
Yes,
attorneys.
yes. We're so lucky that we have this robust community that's able to provide free legal services.
Walk and chew gum at the same time.
Yeah. To find out some more information about available cases at MVLS, you can see our pro bono portal. And here's just a quick list of some upcoming trainings that are going to be happening. I'd like to just highlight the training that's occurring on January 10th. This will be an in-person training out in Frederick. We'll be talking about advocating for trafficking survivors and really looking at the collateral consequences of criminal records and helping attorneys and advocates are welcome to join, though the training is a bit more geared towards attorneys so that they can assist with criminal record relief for clients that need help, including survivors of trafficking and those who might be at risk of further exploitation. And with that, again, lots of information you can access. Please visit MVLS's website. There's a way to sign up again. We really appreciate your joining in today.
Thank you.
And with that, we hope to see you next time. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.